The floor is open. Bob, you've been enormously generous in answering a wide range of questions. So I'm sure a number of our audience will have thoughts as well. Let me ask you either to go with the standing mic in the back or use the traveling mic that's coming around. Be sure to introduce yourself, tell us where you're coming from, and then fire away. Young lady right here.
Thank you. Pays to sit in the front, I guess. Thank you very much, sir. My name's Lisa Friedman. I'm with Climate Wire. We're an energy policy publication in DC. I was hoping you could first clarify the role that you either are taking or have already taken with the Romney campaign. And on climate, can you've been obviously a outspoken advocate for addressing climate change in developing countries. As you go forward with the campaign, how do you envision squaring your commitment to climate change with, with a candidate who has equivocated on climate and with a party that increasingly, is led by lawmakers who really don't believe that the science in climate change and don't want to put the money to some of the programs that you've helped start at the World Bank?
Well, your first question was, what can I say about my possible work with the campaign after I leave? And the answer is nothing. And that, of course, takes away your precept for your second question. But to try to be constructive, look, let me say a word about the bank, but then also connect this a little bit with the politics. We're going to having the 20th anniversary of Rio. Okay, one of the other penalties for the sins in my life, which I wouldn't acknowledge to Fred, is that I steered the U.S. policy with Bill Riley and others for the last 3 years. And we actually put together the Climate Change Framework Convention, which I thought was a pretty good convention because it built in various types of flexibilities for national programs and also for uncertainty. So, some people objected to Kyoto. I was one of them because I didn't think it would work. And I thought that if you didn't have developing countries as part of solving this problem, you wouldn't sustain the support in developed countries. So just because somebody opposes something in climate change doesn't necessarily mean they're ignoring the issue or that they're wrong. We actually turned out to be right. I think Kyoto was actually kind of a diversion for a long time period in an unproductive fashion. At the bank, one of the ways that I thought we could make the best effect was to recognize developing countries have to be part of the solution, and developing countries are also affected by these changes. So Hank Paulson, a Republican Secretary of the Treasury, I might add, given your political comment, got together with me and we said, what could we really do to jumpstart this? So we created these climate investment funds. And Hank and I raised, at that time, about $5 billion. I've raised about $2 billion more to finance funds to try to help with energy efficiency projects, transport projects, adaptation projects, forestation projects, a whole range of practical things. We've leveraged that to about $50 billion, projects in about 45 countries around the world. And in the process, not only have learned some things and done some good, we brought developing countries into the process in a more constructive way. And just as a good example, many people here who have negotiated with India know it's sometimes can be a challenging partner. The Indian environment minister, who's now moved on to another job, told me he wanted to do a project with the bank through the climate investment funds because he wanted to show India's support for the climate investment funds and the role that the World Bank did with it. So these are the types of ways you can build momentum on the ground. And just again give you a very practical sense of this, it relates to Fred's question about sort of multilateralism. We at the bank, my team and I personally worked very closely with President Calderon before the Cancun meeting. And part of it was my concern after Copenhagen that if your goal is to get 195 countries to agree to every word in a 1,000-page agreement, that may not be as productive as getting 150 to agree on avoided deforestation, 140 to agree on soil carbon, 130, by the way, the framework agreement of Rio permits all this as opposed to having others. And so President Calderon had a pretty successful meeting making progress on this. And in addition, One of the things that I suggested to the Mexicans was the best chance to actually bring all the countries together on an agreement would be if you're making the moving parts work, including for small island states, for example, with their special issues. So you need to think about the politics as well as some of the climate economics issues. And that's exactly what he did. There was one country that resisted at the end, and you need to expect that in diplomacy, which was Bolivia. And one of the things we also, based on some diplomatic experience, was suggested to the Mexicans that people might think consensus means all countries, but in the wonderful world of international diplomacy, it may not necessarily mean all countries. So they left Bolivia out, and they got a consensus on this. So there are a couple points of this. One is, I think if you're really serious about these issues, you got to bring developing countries in. You have to listen to them. You have to do this in ways that show the commonality of interest. I just alluded to soil carbon. Some experts believe soil carbon could be, absorbing about 14% of the carbon, where avoided deforestation is 17%. And this is a great opportunity to work with places like sub-Saharan Africa to be able to increase and improve their agriculture. But how do you develop the systems? How do you measure it? How do you make sure that people get the incentives right? How do you try to make sure that the techniques to put carbon into the soil are developed? These are the types of things that the bank can do. So I guess what I would just say is that I think also when it comes time to bringing around support in the United States, and these climate investment funds we put together ended up having to have U.S. appropriations, Republicans as well as Democrats supported those appropriations. So I think what I'm always concerned about in this field, or biodiversity, which is another one I have a strong interest in, is that if you draw the dividing lines, and as your question said, well, Republicans are on the wrong side, the other guys are on the right side, well, then you've just lost 50% of the people. I don't think that's as productive a way to go, whether it's developing in developed world or the U.S. politics. Come up with practical solutions. A lot of people, we've taken avoided deforestation and we added a wildlife premium working with the World Wildlife Fund. There's a lot of people across the political spectrum that are interested in animal conservation issues. So find things to bring people together as opposed to divide them.
Danny?
Thank you, Brad. Danny Xufengjiang with China's Xinhua News Agency. President Zoellick, several years ago, you coined the phrase responsible stakeholder to address China's role in the global system. In your perspective, does this generalization still applies well to China, or you want to upgrade it? What are the priorities for a country like China to balance its domestic challenges like employment and rising global expectation on it as a rising power in the world? Thank you.
Well, there's a lot that could go into that question, and let me just emphasize that the logic trying to build on the exchange that Fred and I had is that China's growth and development strategy over the past 30 years benefited enormously from this international economic structure and security structure that the United States and the trilateral community and others had created. So even though China is a developing country, it's in its interest to support that system, to be a stakeholder and to do so responsibly. I gave examples on the development side where I think, frankly, China has been a very good and supportive partner from the World Bank. From everything from analytical work that'll drive others to now we're working with China about possible manufacturing investment in Africa to the IDA example. If you look at the economic crisis, I guess if I compare China's performance with Europe's, I would say that China at least ranks pretty well. But here's where I think the real issue is going to be. We're going to have economic tensions, and for a lot of different reasons. The good news is the economic community in China, I think, has developed a strong network of ties, not only in the United States, but in Europe and Japan and all throughout the world. And so we might mess it up, but I think there's a reasonable chance that we could try to find win-win solutions, or where we have to disagree, we try to manage the disagreements, which happens in all of international relations. I'm a little more concerned on the security side, because you don't have that web of ties. So both the United States and China have tried to develop a mill-mill dialogue, and I think that's a good thing. I've encouraged it, but it tends to be a little bit of a show and tell. And I think part of this may be structural, which we're going to have to think about how to get at. the People's Liberation Army reports to the Central Military Commission, of which there are 2 civilian members. And so you don't really have a National Security Council structure like you do in the United States or European systems. And so we don't really have the Pall Mill dialogue on security issues that is anything remotely like what you have in the economic side. And so this would be my suggestion, is to take the notion of sort of developing a security system and common interest in the security system, and perhaps learn some lessons from the economic side. And just to be encouraging, you know, think of some of the common interests. China's a big commodity importer. It should have a very strong interest in freedom of the seas. It should have an interest in energy security. It has concerns about Islamic radicalism. It should have concerns about Afghanistan and Pakistan and stability. You certainly don't want North Korea creating sort of a security threat to its neighbors. So there's a lot of issues if you can create the right structures, and I don't think we're quite there yet on the security side.
Let me ask you just to elaborate one piece of that. You praised China's role in the development area, but there are, of course, a lot of people in the development field who worry that China, through its huge lending and investments in African countries in particular, without adhering to any of the kinds of conditions and responsibilities that have come traditionally with World Bank and other development lending, are undermining rather than supporting the system of transfers that has developed over the years, including on good governance, transparency, some of the things you've mentioned. What's your response to that concern?
First, it's a reasonable point. I think that the US and Europe in particular have to be a little careful, because the record of avoiding corruption and proper investment in sub-Saharan African natural resources and others by some European and American countries leaves a little bit to be desired. But I wouldn't stop there, and I would say people need to learn from the mistakes. What we have tried to do is work with both the Chinese and the Africans to recognize, on the one hand, there are things that are in Africa's interest to help them with the negotiations, stress the transparency, stress the inclusive growth, but also work back to the Chinese side and say, you know that if if you're seen, you saw this a little bit in the recent Zambian elections, if you're seen as the heavyweight, not paying attention, not hiring local workers, it will come back and haunt you. Now, China is a vast system. We've got partners in the government that want to work on this. Some of the Chinese companies that get the contracts go do the deals that they did before, in the way they did before. So I think that it's a good type of issue where the bank can be most effective by trying to work on both sides of the equation, both the Chinese and the African side. And I can give you substantial examples where we made some progress. I mean, just to give you one, there was in the case of debt forgiveness, I think it was for the Democratic Republic of Congo, there was going to be a major Chinese investment in mining and infrastructure, and it looked like it might sort of violate the kind of the debt additionality rules that the countries who were forgiving debt would do. So we worked with the Chinese and removed the government guarantee from what was, in a sense, the private sector part of it, but left over some of the public sector report. So I'm not being Pollyannish about this, but what I'm suggesting is there's recognition on the African and the Chinese sides. This is something to develop. And I made a brief allusion to the fact that, the changes in China's economy, where they're going to move up the value-added chain, offer very interesting opportunities to have some low-wage manufacturing move to Africa. We did a report on this. I mean, Justin Lin, the former chief economist, pointed out to me that there's about 85 million low-wage manufacturing jobs in China. In all of Africa, north and south, there's perhaps 8 to 10 million. So if you can simply create the energy, the ports, the logistics, the training to move 5 million of the 85 million, you've improved it by 50%. And we're starting to see some significant changes in Ethiopia. There's already Chinese firms moving from Guangdong, and so some of it for domestic markets, some of it for international. But it's a good example of what we've been talking about today, which is you need to see these opportunities and then try to see what you can do to catalyze them.
Mike?
Thank you, Fred. I would like to join your compliment to Mr. Zoellick for his work as head of the World Bank. I worked there for 20-some years, and even more proud to have worked there after your leadership than
well, thank you. That's very
before.
nice.
But even so, I'm
He's a
going
tough
to
guy, Mike Finger.
even so, I'm going
he's
to
a harsh
ask
critic.
what might be a hard question, and that is, what would you suggest the bank's role should be to help developing countries to avoid trade restrictions and to remove those in place? I ask because I read your published trade strategy, and while it announces a lot of work to support the WTO negotiations, and it says that trade restrictions are not a useful part of a development strategy, that statement has no operational content. It's like the human rights part of the Soviet Constitution. When I looked at the bank's country strategy paper with Argentina, I find that it takes up trade only as, and the phrase sticks in my mind, an avenue of transmission of global instability, which isn't a lead-in for a lot of trade liberalization sort of stuff. So again, the question is, what do you see, or what would you suggest to the World Bank's upcoming president, even though you said you want to be still on that, should be the bank's role in supporting developing country governments to avoid import restrictions and to continue to remove the ones in place?
Yeah, it's a good point. And I think there's a couple of things. One, I've talked about the changing world economy, and I think one of the aspects you're going to see is increased South-South investment, trade, remittances, tourism, and the barriers between developing countries are still much higher than they are between developed and developing countries. So that's a point one can both highlight and encourage about how it can be in countries' interests to drive microeconomic reforms, deal with inflation, so on and so forth. But I think the area that has got the most promise in the short term is one that I've worked with some of the people in this room about, which is that as we did some analyses of the trade logistics, the beyond the border barriers, you can see a lot of these costs are much higher than the traditional tariffs and quotas. And they fit within the WTO and a trade facilitation agenda. And we've been actually trying to work with the WTO to see if they could break that piece free and work an agreement of its nature. But even if they don't do it in that process, we're trying to work with express delivery companies, some computer systems companies, and others to show the huge benefits of being able to move goods more quickly through borders and, frankly, in a more transparent way to combat corruption. And I gave a speech with the Inter-American Dialogue last week where I talked about sort of the costs of doing business and logistics in Latin America compared to some of the East Asian countries. And it's a huge Latin cost in terms of trying to deal with productivity. So I guess what I found with countries is they respond best to self-interest. So if we can show them how certain policies can help them reduce costs, make their industries more productive, and sort of add to their ability to be able to compete internationally, that's probably the most effective starting point. Now let me take one more dimension, and that is, I talked about productivity and service sector. One of the problems in a lot of countries, certainly true in developing countries, people don't even have the data on the barriers. So, the traditional trade negotiations were done by commerce or trade ministries. They have the tariffs, they have the quotas, but the issues in telecommunications or finance or postal services or others are done by different ministries, and they're not part of the trade world. So part of it is even to get the data. This is part of our broader open data initiative to sort of help countries understand what barriers and costs that they built in and then show the overall benefits. So I guess the last point I'd make is I'm glad you raised this issue because I think that, I'm concerned in the broader economic situation we're in that we have some fragilities and cracks of uncertainties, and while we've avoided a broad-based protectionist response so far, I think it's starting to creep up. And I'm starting to see, this is another topic, sort of renationalization of policies, not even necessarily in the formal sort of trade area. And you'll see more of this now in developing countries as they rely more on domestic demand. As they move away from export-led growth, you're going to have to expect that there'll be constituencies that say, we don't want our domestic demand to leak out. And so there'll be different types of administrative measures. So this is an issue that I've actually just been talking with my staff in the past weeks about how we want to try to highlight and influence this more. And the final observation is, coming back to the role of some of the advanced economies in leadership, please recall, when I was U.S. trade representative, I did a lot of free trade agreements with developing countries. And I saw it as much as a development strategy as a trade strategy. Now, some of the trade purists say, well, why are you doing these? These are small economies. But a lot of those trade agreements were very effective in getting microeconomic reforms in countries like Morocco or the Gulf or Central America and others. So a good American trade strategy could help too.
Okay, we're approaching our closing hour. So there's three, I guess 4 people at the mic. So let me ask them to ask their questions together, and we'll group them. That's a little hard for you, but let's do that. So introduce each of yourselves, fire your question, and then I'll ask Bob to answer as a group.
Barry Wood from RTHK in Hong Kong. Reflecting back on your experience in Europe at the time of German unification, monetary union in Germany, what's your sense of how this monetary crisis with the euro is ultimately going to work out? And do you sense that European countries are willing to give up the sovereignty necessary for a fiscal union?
John Williamson of the Peterson Institute. In responding to Fred's question about the succession in the World Bank, you remarked that there was an advantage in having a US citizen at the head of one of these organizations. Now, I think many of us would agree with that, but at the same time, it doesn't follow that it has to be the World Bank that as an American citizen is head of. Is it not your opinion that, in fact, or can you conceive that it might be true that having that an agreement in which an American, well, in which there was a general formula that the best person in the world was going to be appointed to head an organization, would result in as many Americans as in fact come about as a result of the present compromise system?
Maybe more.
Dick Smith, State Department. Bob, it's great after all these years to have the benefit of your clear reality-based analysis once again.
Thank you.
My question relates to the attitude of the developing countries toward the World Bank. At the time I was working on the Montreal Protocol Fund in 1990 in London, we ran into very strong and surprising to me resistance from the developing countries to having a fund managed by the World Bank in the World Bank, and we set up a jury-rigged operation where they had an executive committee of the parties in London, and it was where they'd take the bank's money, but they didn't want the bank managing the fund. Is that still the case, or has that attitude changed over the years?
Hi, Rich Behar, Forbes. Thank you. President Zoellick, I think one of the things you have been credited with accomplishing is bringing a flat budget to the bank during your term. And that certainly can't be easy to put an elephant on a diet. And I'm just wondering, were there ways to actually still receive money off budget, perhaps directly from shareholders, trust funds, ways to fund things that aren't funded on budget in order to not skin the organization too much? Or was it a flat real budget, totally?
Well, for the first question about sort of Germany and Europe, obviously we could go on a while on this one, so let me try to deal with it at a macro level. These are only decisions Europeans can make because they are fundamentally issues of political economy and the future of Europe, not just economic decisions. However, I think that since you drew the analogy to German unification, one of the key elements of the success in German unification was that Chancellor Kohl and President Bush got ahead of events, even though they were moving fast, and they sketched a direction. We could debate what are the exact elements that need to go into preserving Europe. I think the Germans have, on the one hand, are right about the need to get fiscal consolidation and structural reforms. Where I think it's been unfortunate is that whether it's banking system, whether it's trying to have assurance of medium-term financing for reforms in places like Spain and Italy that will be a medium-term, that the responses have sort of dribbled out in a way that has lost the benefit of getting ahead of the problem. So I think history has given Germany a role that isn't easy because of both Germany's reluctance to be seen as sort of throwing its weight around. But I think the reality is there's no choice, and I think that there's still a potential solution set, but it requires taking steps that don't just give money away, but that would show countries such as Spain and Italy that if they undertake these serious reforms, that they will be backed and supported, and that the process of sort of a day late and a euro short, unfortunately, just adds to the size of the problem and adds to the uncertainty in markets and makes the problem harder. So it really is kind of a challenging question of sort of political economy strategy, and that's, I think, what we're still going to be seeing tested over the next couple weeks. There was a question about the developing countries and with the role of the bank. That's a very interesting question, and it depends somewhat on ministries. You still find some of that attitude in some of the foreign ministries and in some of the environmental ministries. If you deal with the financial and the economic and increasingly the prime ministers, because of some of the things we've done, they've seen how we can be a very good development partner. So it's our challenge to continue to sort of expand that capability. I think we made some progress over the years, but it's why I took a little bit of time on your climate change question. See, sometimes the climate change negotiations are kind of prisoners of people who are more interested in coming up with the semicolons in the 1,000-page text and arguing out rather arcane legal points, as opposed to making things happen. And we're sort of the blue-collar workers of this field. We're trying to make things happen on the ground. And the more we do that, I think the more support that we can build. And the encouraging point is, again, when I came to the bank, I don't want to overstate this, Jim Wolfensohn had made some very good progress on this. The environmental community was still quite suspicious, and as I leave the bank, I've got them coming in and wanting us to do more in oceans and various animal species groups that we've tried to help, and that's an encouraging side. That's what you want to have. Then there was the Forbes question. What was the other one in between?
An American.
Yeah.
Which
wasn't this question. Yeah, but I will just say this: is that certainly. First off, look. While I like to push the international system towards appropriate set of ideals and rationalities, as one of you said, I also take a realistic approach. And good luck ever making the international system based totally on some judgment of merit, whatever the heck that is. And I mean, it's the reality. I mean, here, let's take a real case, because I think this is rather telling. The president of the EBRD, Thomas Miro, did a fantastic job. Fantastic job. He was the best partner I had on any of these issues. He was innovative, thoughtful, knows Europe. I would go to him. And basically, his own government sold him down the road for a trade for something else, which ended up not working. Okay, so that's the real world. Okay, so we need to try to move the system. We need to try to. So I'm all for people trying to increase the credentials and performance. But the reality is the United States is the largest power in the world, and if there's not some assurance, people will push it to the side because there'll be 1,000 reasons why the largest power can't run an organization. So I'm in full agreement. As you may know, because it's something I didn't learn until recently, the U.S. originally wanted the IMF post, but Harry Dexter White ran into some problems with his political background, and so they ended up taking the World Bank as kind of the second. So here I am, right? And then on the flat real budget, thank you for noticing that. It did take a lot of work. It is a flat real budget. It's not so easy when you triple your lending to do it the same budget. We did have some bands, but we were under the sort of target amount some years as much as it is over the band. And my own belief was that, having served in other organizations, the bank was a relatively well-resourced place, and if we disciplined our staff and people, we could use the current resources effectively, and that would help us make the case for, at a time that, you know, I still have to raise money for IDA for the poorest countries, that we're watching where every dollar goes. But you also mentioned, you know, we do raise money. For example, these climate investment funds are a trust fund, and we do manage a lot of trust funds. Those aren't really so much for expenses, although there's some that go into certain projects of these. And the trust funds are a sensitive point at the bank, because on the one hand, people worry that the donor community will be too influential in determining our priorities as opposed to leaving it to our board. On the other hand, it's not a bad market test. You use trust funds to have a sense of kind of where you're performing well, and the lessons that you can learn, and where people are interested in having some additional support. And in a practical sense, it sometimes allows you to get a group of countries. For example, we've done some very interesting things in the gender area, or rule of law area, or social accountability to help deal with corruption. And you often will get some of the countries, whether they the Nordics or the British or the Australians or the Canadians and others, who help support this. And so it's a good way of recognizing that countries can have their own bilateral aid programs, but linked to the multilateral system. And in fact, this is an interesting observation. It's something I really didn't have a full sense of until I came to the bank. The US doesn't do this very well, in part because perhaps AID is big enough to operate on its own, but the British DFID, the Australians, the Canadians are far better at sort of leveraging the bank with their aid resources. I think they get, you know, more for their money that way, and they also, frankly, I think, you know, build some support in the institutions by doing so.
Final question over here, Alton. And you've got a mic right here.
You're very kind. Thank you. Alton Fry from the Council on Foreign Relations. Thank you, Fred, and thank you, Bob. It would be a sad thought to believe that the disappointments in the trade negotiations are the end of the story. But are we essentially frozen until after the rolling crisis in Europe and the economic distresses here are solved? Or are there some things that could be done, particularly to exploit trade opportunities beyond those already exploited, to help the 79 poorest countries?
First, I have to thank Alton. I think Alton was the person who first got me into the Council on Foreign Relations, so that really dates us all. But there are things one can do, and there's things one can set up. Okay, so let's take on the do category. You know, keep in mind, you know, the supposed isolationist withdrawing Republican Congress was the one that insisted that President Obama not only pass the Korean Free Trade Agreement, but also the Colombian-Panama Free Trade Agreement. So when I talk to members in the House, there's actually a lot of interest in trying to do trade issues. So there's something to kind of work with. I just had dinner with Senator Baucus, the chairman of the Finance Committee. He's always been very good on these issues. And so I think there may be a better sort of context up there than people recognize, but of course you have to take care of some of their politics and stuff. The second point would be, in the WTO context, I think this trade facilitation accord that we've been trying to support could be done and broken out of the WTO, and it could be of huge benefit, and we could help with the regional development banks to try to finance it. Third, and here I'll point to some of the work of the Peterson Institute, I think we need to think out of the box now about some other possibilities, you know, whether it may be sectoral accords in services, or here's an interesting one, and it just shows the slightly different mindset. Probably like you've been reading in the newspaper about the various anti-dumping or countervailing duty suits or safeguards or whatever with clean energy, okay? And, you know, remember in the 1990s, in the Clinton administration, they took the boom of information technology and created an information technology sectoral accord. It was probably a tremendous advance in terms of removing barriers to supply chains and sort of innovation and benefit for consumers. So why not flip it? Why not take clean technology and opposed to figure out how many barriers we can get into a fight with each other and say, let's make this a sectoral accord for trade liberalization. So I think this is where, and I'll look to the Peterson Institute of this, I think there's more that can be done in the Western Hemisphere. You know, the United States now has free trade agreements with countries that represent 54% of the GDP, not counting the United States. Well, we could start to integrate some of those free trade agreements. We could actually start to do some things to kind of have sort of more common sourcing, like we did in the case of the CAFTA agreement. And, you know, this is where you have to be opportunistic. You know, there may be a moment where Brazil also sees its interest in trying to open up its service sector for more competition. Maybe they see their competition more from China than they do from the United States. So if we could start to take some of those Latin American partners and start to reach out to some of the countries where we don't yet have free trade in Latin America. So I think one of the things I would like to encourage the trade community is, you know, when you get stuck in a corner, you know, let's try to think of a slightly different path out. And there's a lot of them out there.
Well, we're having a conference here on Tuesday to discuss exactly those issues. And we've done some work on green sectoral agreements, so we'll try to respond. Bob, let me say it's a great thing, I think, for Americans, but also for citizens of the world, when it turns out there's no conflict between the criteria of nationality requirement and merit in putting someone at the head of an international institution. And I don't think even those who criticize the U.S. having the job of World Bank president were critical of your being the World Bank president. So we're again deeply in your debt. I think you've validated my comment that you're one of the outstanding operational leaders as well as thought leaders among public servants of this or any other generation. We look forward to the many future contributions I'm sure you're going to make. We thank you all for what you've done these last 5 years, and we thank you particularly for sharing your thoughts with us today. We're in your debt. Meeting adjourned.